Steve Albini is the music industry maverick, a man with a steadfast integrity in both his business dealings and his approach to recording music. Despite this punk rock approach and his refusal to pander to the mainstream, he has worked with major artists such as Nirvana, Page & Plant, Pixies and many others. Although majoring in journalism at college, music was the centre of Steve's life, picking up the bass in 1979 after being inspired by the first wave of punk bands. This led him to form Big Black in 1981, and also using his journalism skills to write for fanzines centred around the fertile hardcore punk scene in Chicago. The unusual inclusion of a drum machine in Big Black showed early signs of Steve's idiosyncrasies that would later lead him to stand out from the crowd as a producer. It was while in Big Black that he started to gain interest in the process of recording and acquiring the means to record other bands within the local scene. In 1986, the same year Big Black released their debut album Atomizer, he bought a bungalow and set up an 8-track studio. His skills were quickly realised as his reputation started to spread, and he began receiving engineering opportunities from bands outside his immediate circle. By the winter of 1987, he was able to leave his job and transition into a full-time recording engineer. As he became busy with offers of work, he invested in more equipment and undertook the task of rebuilding his studio. He purchased a larger 24-track machine and several pieces of outboard equipment. One of the first records he produced from a major band was Urge Overkill's Strange Eye in 1986, and things quickly developed from here, and after a busy few years, Steve found himself producing the classic alternative rock album Surfer Rosa by the Pixies. His approach to production was straightforward and unrelenting. Capture the unique essence of a band's character without getting in the way of their creative vision. Albini's methodology involved recording bands as a cohesive unit, recognising that capturing their live performance would give them the most authentic representation of a track. This approach worked incredibly well for the Pixies, as their intricate layers of riffs and concise, impactful songs, with many tracks on Surfer Rosa lasting less than 2 minutes, thrived on the collective attitude they created, rather than relying on technical things like effects and production gimmicks. He's actually gone on record saying that recording a band is a purely technical issue, in the sense that he's doing little more than documenting what's happening as faithfully as possible. "I'd be very happy if my fingerprints weren't visible," he said. This approach appealed to many artists within the punk and alternative rock scene, and saw Albini become even busier than before, producing bands such as The Wedding Present, The Breeders and Jesus Lizard. All very successful bands in their own right, but none were even remotely close to the three-piece from Seattle that made their call to Steve in 1993. The band, of course, was Nirvana, and the album In Utero. The band's decision to hire Albini stemmed from their admiration of his work on the Pixies and the Breeders' album Pod. In particular, Cobain wanted to incorporate Albini's technique of capturing the natural acoustics of a room instead of artificial reverb. This technique involves a particular room mic setup. For instance, on drums, Steve will lay 2 omnidirectional microphones on the floor. Of late, he appears to use the Octava MK012s. These are relatively inexpensive, probably a good thing considering their vulnerability on the floor. What he then does with these mics is delay them each slightly differently, around 20 milliseconds for one side and 22 the other. Here is an example of the effect it adds. And here it is on Dave Grohl's drums. It definitely helped that Steve chose a great studio to record the album at. Pachyderm Studios was located in a fairly remote part of Minnesota, meaning they had little distraction when work began. This worked perfectly, and the basic tracks were done in the first 2 days. In less than 3 days, they recorded 15 songs. Once the basic tracks were recorded, they were analysed to see if they needed any extra guitar overdubs, cymbals or string parts. After assessment, the vocals were needed to be recorded, which was Kurt's domain, since he hadn't turned up with any completed lyrics. Dave Grohl said, "There were some days where nothing would happen for hours, and we'd just be sitting there waiting for something to go down." After all the overdubs and vocal tracks were laid down, the album was finished in the eyes of Albini. Once Geffen, Nirvana's record company, got hold of it though, they deemed some of the songs not radio-worthy and not complete. With pressure to alter the songs, the band then went to Scott Litt, R.E.M's producer and friend. He remixed their single All Apologies and Heart-Shaped Box, which didn't sit well with Steve, although he completely understood and even anticipated this outcome. Right at the beginning, Steve had laid it all out to Kurt in a lengthy letter he penned detailing his terms. He said, "I think the very best thing you could do at this point is exactly what you're talking about doing. Bang out a record in a couple of days with high quality but minimal production and no interference from the front office bullet heads. If that's what you want to do, I would love to be involved. If instead, you find yourself in the position of being temporarily indulged by the record company, only to have them yank the chain at some point, hassling you to rework songs, sequences and production, calling in hired guns to sweeten your record, turning the whole thing over to some remix jockey, then you're in for a bummer and I want no part of it." Albini also refused the offer of a royalty percentage, at the time in 1983, estimated to be worth around $500,000, and instead proposed a flat fee of $100,000, stating that he's merely there to work for the band and provide a service like a plumber would provide, and taking a royalty would be like claiming some ownership of the music, and in his mind, this was immoral. This encounter with the majors was everything Albini expected, and after this, he believed they were even more wary of him, and considered him to be a trouble causer who refused to play the corporate game, which to be fair was true and entirely the point. This appealed to PJ Harvey though, who employed Steve to produce her album Rid of Me. The production was another example of representing the artists how they wanted to be heard, as the stark sound was intentional but also polarised the listeners, some loving it and some not so keen on this raw, stripped-back approach. Despite some of those opinions, he did continue to work with other big artists such as Page and Plant, recording their album Walking into Clarksdale at Abbey Road. "I'm working with them," he said. "I would do another record with Page and Plant in a heartbeat. They were totally professional with me. It was clear they were in charge of everything, but it was also clear that they appreciate the effort that everybody was making on their behalf." With his success in the 90s, Albini bought the building that would become Electrical Audio, his personal recording studio. The main reason to make the move to this studio was the lack of privacy for Albini and his wife. His former studio was in their house, eventually taking over almost all the rooms, with the exception of the bedroom. Comprised of 2 studios, the main room houses a 48-channel Neotech console that records to tape, both multitrack and mixdown. There is no permanent Pro Tools rig set up at Electrical Audio, and Steve is steadfastly sticking to the analog domain for 2 main reasons. The first is practicality, as he doesn't trust digital media storage, stating that he can pick up a reel recorded in 1985 and have the session up resurrected with relative ease. With the fast pace of hardware and software technology, that simply isn't possible with computers, even just a decade down the line. Secondly is the sound and workflow, because of the bass response and tonal stability of his specific machines, and the way working with analog tape limits the scope and draws in the focus of the engineer. A lot of his clients don't have a lot of time, so making decisions as early in the process as possible pays dividends when it comes to mixing. Generally speaking, the final mix isn't miles away from the first playback of the first take. If there's something fundamentally wrong at that point in time, you should stop and fix it, Albini said. That part of training in the analog technique, you don't presume you can make something better later. Electrical Audio does have some incredibly impressive gear, although one of his strongest traits is his ability to get the most out of the equipment without making the equipment the focus of attention. For example, he doesn't discriminate between expensive and renowned pieces of studio kit and budget pieces you could pick up at a guitar shop. A good example is the Octava MK012 microphone set that I already mentioned earlier, and the FMR really nice compressor costing only $150, although with compressors, he's not overly keen. I'm not a fan of the sound of compression, and I try to avoid it. There will occasionally be compression on individual instruments in the mix, but not often. I don't normally try to get rid of wild dynamics, I try to incorporate them. If it sounds good, it sounds good. If it doesn't, it doesn't. When I can hear compression working, I'm kind of irritated by it. It bothers me because it seems like I'm hearing the machine rather than the band. Despite having some incredible reverb units on hand like the AKG BX20, Steve is reluctant to use them very often, because I don't think it's as necessary as most engineers and producers think it is, Steve said. They use it almost as a reaction, an automatic reflex. When a singer starts singing, they put a reverb on it. It's a thing that's done pro forma a lot of the time. They put it on because they feel they're supposed to. I've never had that response. I'll wait until someone says, "That sounds weird," and then I'll try reverb. Steve Albini's approach to production and engineering is definitely unique, and maybe not to everyone's taste, but there's no doubting his integrity and love for what he does.